one match, which was Elise Cornet against Yelena Ostapenko. So a French lady. But yeah, it kind of just shows you how extreme the split was last year, and of why there's been a lot of talk this year about how are we divvying up who's on the night matches. Obviously, Maresmo just took over last year as the tournament director. You would think maybe a female tournament director, you'd be like, oh, there's going to be a few more, women's matches taking center stage. But they basically cited, TV audience demand, because obviously, the night match is kind of for a global audience as well. So
Yeah.
they were saying that the demand is mainly coming for those men's matchups. But I think this year it could be a bit different, because I think there's a few more rivalries on the women's side that are gonna pique interest compared to well, obviously last year with the men's you had Rafa in there, so straight away
Mm,
there's going to be a few matches of his that are going to be put in those night matches. But this year we don't have him on the men's side, so that's probably a few less matches already on the men's side. And then I think obviously with
yeah.
the talk of this big three on the women's side, people are going to be interested to see how each of those players do, as well as a couple of the other players as well. So I think you should look this year for more. Maybe not. I don't think it's going to be 50-50 still, but I think closer to like 4 of the 10, or maybe they're going to do more than 10, could be women's matches. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think about this general? we always talk about the we talk about prize money, and then we talk about like when we talked about that Masters event, it didn't even have Monte Carlo doesn't even have women's matches being played.
Yeah.
Things like that. There's always this, you know, the money is obviously greater on the ATP side of things. Like, I don't know, what do you think about the kind of split of these night matches? Because I think it's quite symbolic of the overall kind of not fight, but the battle that's kind of going on between men's and women's viewership of their matches.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when it comes to basically why night matches exist, I think that's part of the problem in itself. Is we should be organizing a schedule where that isn't a problem. A lot of people argue that you should start earlier in the day, and that would, sort of alleviate some of this. A lot of the time, night matches happen because, it's the last one scheduled in a day, and it's shoved to the end of a schedule because a couple of matches have been a bit too long, and that's just how tennis works, for example. And it is a risk of a tournament, so players sort of have to be prepared to do that. But it is a bit ridiculous if you're playing at like 1, 2 a.m. in the morning. Especially if you've got to play in 2 days' time, right? You've played into the morning. You've
Mm.
not actually slept that day. You can't then use your other day for rest slash training or whatever because it's sort of ruined. So yeah, it's a really, really tough question. And what I always wonder is how could I relate it back to sort of how everyone else runs their day-to-day life. And what I would say is it's like being asked to do a night shift and then coming into work immediately the day after. It's sort of like that in terms of a tennis scheduling scenario. Um, it's not necessarily like you get the break that you should be getting. So therefore, we should be doing everything we can to avoid it. So there's the problem. Okay, so if we're trying to limit it, that would hopefully remove the issue of the viewership aspect of that. Because
Mm.
again, like we're talking about, we put men's matches on in those prime times because it brings in more money. That's a fact. So it's not a good fact, but it is a fact. And it also brings well, more viewers, more money. It's the same thing, really. But how you change that? Okay, maybe women's tennis is getting to a point where starting to get rivalries and stuff like that that will encourage more people to be interested in the women's side of the game. But at the same time, it might never reach that same level because obviously people have this ingrained opinion, not necessarily the right opinion either, that men's tennis is better, more intense, more skillful, whatever they want to say on their argument that will inevitably be probably wrong. But like I say, all of these things exist. So changing that now, I don't know if it's necessarily the answer. I think there's another way to fix it. I think that night matches and the unbalanced viewership, it's a symptom of the problem. But fixing that, it's not going to make any solutions.
Interesting. So you think they should just start earlier in the day?
I think that is part of the issue. I think that would help. Because I think night matches is something that, regardless of who you are, you could argue here, that actually it's favourable. The fact that it's fewer women are getting pushed into the night matches, it's actually favourable in that regard because they're not having to play later. And therefore it's not impeding on their next day of rest or training before their next matches. Whereas with the men, they get put on ridiculous times, for example, all because they're trying to maximize viewership in another country or region of countries. And it does become, obviously rough for the schedule. So you could argue here it's a good thing and you could argue here it's a bad thing. But we're not making that decision as a community when to put those matches on because one is going to be better than the other or anything like that. It's just sort of capitalist, which is inherently a little sexist. But yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of become a natural thing that most tournaments are doing now, right? They're having these night matches. Yeah. I mean, it's obviously been a big thing in the Australian Open for a while and the US Open. I don't know, I guess they see it as like it adds to the spectacle. I don't know, the night match under the lights, it's all part of the marketing and trying to attract people to watch. But they could just start. Yeah, I suppose the argument against starting earlier is the fact that can fans get into the complex at such a time? That's probably the argument against starting earlier. But then again, these night matches are tailored towards a global audience anyway, so it's like, who's really prioritized here? It's a difficult one. So yeah, maybe the issue is more actually it's worse playing night matches rather than the fact that there's less women's matches being shown at this time. But again, I think it's just symbolic of that eternal battle between the men's and women's game in terms of viewership and stuff.
That's where I agree with you. You're right. It is symbolic. It's a symptom of that wider problem. That is, we have this idea that people only really, really want to watch women, that want to watch men's tennis, for example. Whereas I don't necessarily think that's true. A lot of the time, I think it's because it's on. You're like, oh, I'll watch that one then. It's quite hard to access women's matches. So if you improve the access, make the access equal opportunity for people to watch both, then you will see improvements in that balance.
Yeah, it's almost liken it to like women's football where no one really knew what the audience was and how big it was until they started like using bigger stadiums, and then like, oh, they're actually like filling out these bigger stadiums in these bigger tournaments. It's like, oh, the demand is there. So you don't actually know until you actually try it to see how many people actually watch. And I think, there's more rivalries developing on the women's side. I think ultimately that's what it's about. It's about having a storyline behind it, right? Because I know, people think men play like higher quality tennis or whatever, but realistically, when we watched like Nadal, Djokovic, Federer, that was all about, right? I mean, they were amazing players, but the storyline behind it was a lot of the appeal, right? Everyone was in like one camp, and that's what made it high stakes. So I think it's more about actual rivalries than the actual top level of tennis that it is, because I think they all play incredible tennis anyway, so it's not like you're going to be disappointed by the level of the points that they're playing. I think it's just about developing those storylines.